Hey folks, keep it Wausome podcast. I have with me today Eric Giordano. Eric is my former political science professor, and he happens to be the executive director of the Wisconsin Institute for Public Policy and Service. I managed to get that right, which is pretty impressive. I thought I'd get at least one word wrong there, but I wanted Eric to come on the podcast today to talk about this election, which has been pretty nuts, and I have a lot of notes of things that I think are worth talking about, and I kind of want to start off with just kind of setting the tone of like how we got here. So we've had President Donald Trump in office for 4 years, and in that time, we've seen first we saw the economy booming, and then once coronavirus hit, that pretty much went by the wayside, and I've seen my own stocks plummet and then kind of rise back up to sort of a middle level. And the coronavirus cases are kind of out of control right now. They're getting worse, especially where we live, and we have a very divided nation with an election process that has taken much longer than it usually has. And Eric, maybe you can talk a little bit. I could too, but talk a little bit about why this election looks so much different than most elections do.
Wow. Okay, that's a big question, but it's great to be here, Brian. Good to see you.
Yeah.
I think it starts, honestly, it just starts with the president himself, right? I mean, he's a norm buster. He's busted almost every norm that you can think of with regard to, even going back 4 years ago to the 2016 election, he just didn't raise the amount of money or the way that candidates typically raise money. So, he kind of ran an extremely populist campaign, probably the most populist campaign we've seen in decades, and was successful. And then once he got into office, he did not conform to any of the sort of standards around communication, as we know with his famous tweets and
Right.
how he went about, appointing people and, revolving door cabinet members and staff and just he just hasn't followed any script that
Yeah.
anybody could write. So I mean, in that sense, this election was just sort of a culmination of all of that,
Hmm.
kind of coming to a head.
And I
Uh,
want to, before I let you go further, one of the things I probably should have made clear is, I consider myself an independent, so I don't really consider myself a Democrat or a Republican, and I believe you are somewhat in the same way. Is that fair to say?
if you remember from our political science classes, I never revealed that to the students. But
Yeah,
honestly, yeah,
I never was able to guess it either.
that was my goal. So yeah, I mean, I mean, honestly, for your viewers, I would characterize myself as very fiercely independent, and I
Yeah.
voted for candidates on both sides of the aisle. Yeah, so I really try to walk that walk, I guess.
So and that's a big part of why I wanted you to have on to discuss this, and why I feel, I have a list of notes that I made for this podcast, which is not usually how I do my podcast, but I have points of criticism to analyze both candidates. So no, just so people know before we go any further, neither Trump nor Biden is going to come out unscathed from this podcast.
Oh yeah, I mean,
Uh,
absolutely. We've got to talk about the Democrats because they've got some serious challenges and problems.
mhm.
So yeah, but I'll take your lead. So let us know where you want to go.
But yeah, so continue. We got here, and we've had, like you said, we've had a president who's definitely a norm buster. That's true. That's for sure true. And in especially a lot of really strange ways this election, which we'll get into to
Yeah, I
later.
mean,
But no, go
well,
ahead.
yeah, I mean, well, let's also just put President Trump aside for a minute. I mean, COVID-19 has just thrown this whole election in complete, I don't want to say disarray. I mean, it happened, right? Remarkably
Yeah.
peacefully and so forth. But just how the two campaigns did their campaigning was just unprecedented, right? I mean, Trump on the one hand saying, look, I'm a man of the people. I'm going to go out to the people. I don't really give a crap about the coronavirus, or that's not quite what he said. I care, but people can choose, and I choose to go and be with the people, and that's my strength, and I'm proud of it. And Biden was like, hey, I'm going to protect the people. I'm going to protect myself. I'm going to campaign virtually. I mean, there was a lot of people in Wisconsin that were really disappointed when the Democratic convention basically just said, not only are we not holding it, but then Biden himself wasn't going to be there in person. And
Hmm.
then he carried out his campaign almost completely virtually. I mean, he went places obviously, but he just really uh, ran essentially a virtual campaign. And wow, just incredibly different, incredibly unusual. I wondered myself if that might hurt Biden in a way, because really you didn't have the kind of same crowd gatherings, celebratory events that you would normally have in a campaign. But look, it looks like he's going to be the winner here, and so you can't overly criticize what he did. He did what he thought he needed to do, and he did enough apparently.
Hmm. And what's also so unusual about this election is we have, because of coronavirus, we have so many people voting absentee. I'm pretty sure it was a record number. I didn't look at the exact numbers, but I can't imagine it's not a record number since we've had the highest turnout since I believe 1908. I had read another journalist report, and so we had people, and then we had some places where votes were not allowed to be counted until either after the polls close or at least that very day, and that's one of the reasons why we've had such a drawn out process.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, that whole thank you for bringing up the absentee ballot issue, because obviously that was another part of the campaign strategies for both that really factored in, obviously, to how this election played out. As you said, Biden really encouraged, and the Democratic machine, if you will, all across the country, encouraged people to vote as early as possible, to get their vote in, to be safe. If they had to wait for election day in the polls, fine, but be safe at all costs. And Trump was out there literally telling people, do not vote early, do not vote absentee. It's, of course, unless you're me, because he's from Florida, right? So he was voting absentee, but he didn't like the sort of universal mail-in approach, right? That California takes,
Mhm.
that Utah takes, where every voter gets a ballot. So he wasn't opposed necessarily to absentee ballots, but he was opposed to this sort of universal sending out of a dissemination of ballots ahead of time. But anyway, he still encouraged people to show up at the polls, and that's how it kind of played out in terms of the results and how the ballots were counted. And an interesting comparison, Brian, I'm kind of curious about your view on this too, was
Mhm.
Florida, and how the Florida legislature decided it would count its votes versus the Pennsylvania legislature. Are you aware of some of those differences by chance?
I'm not familiar with what Florida did. Well, I know Pennsylvania. I believe it had to be. They couldn't start until after the polls closed. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
correct. And look, I mean, I wasn't a fly on the wall in the strategy meetings, but I'm going to guess that the reason they decided that is because they knew that, well, they didn't want people to not go to the polls, because if the votes had been counted and somehow the vote count, through the absentee ballots, if they were being counted earlier, might have showed Biden with a lead, that might have discouraged people from actually going to the polls. So I think part of the
Mhm.
strategy was, we're going to count the in-person votes on election day first, and then we'll worry about the absentee votes. But what that did, of course, is set up the strange situation we're in, where it appeared that Trump had this victory and he was well
Right.
ahead until these absentee votes started being counted. And then, of course, he's been complaining about how could that possibly happen, that I was ahead for
Right.
so long. Well, it's because that's what the Republican legislature decided, and that's how they
Mhm.
decided to count the votes. Now in Florida, they decided purposely to count all of the votes that were coming in at any time. In other words, to count the votes as they were coming in. So we were getting essentially real time sort of voting numbers and projections. That's why Florida was able to call so early for Trump, because it was clear that whether any outstanding ballots weren't necessarily absentee only or in person only, they were both. And so that's sort of how Florida did it. And it's interesting to see how the two did different vote counting strategies.
It is interesting, and I kind of understand that the point they might be making. It's hard to say. Would seeing Biden have a lead inspire Trump voters to stay home, or would it energize them to go try to balance it out, or say, oh no, our guy's going to lose. We better get to the polls. It's really hard to say which of those might be true, and maybe both, depending on the person. Who knows? What I think is interesting is, this has been one of the higher turnout elections in a long time, and the conventional wisdom was that higher turnout would be favorable to the Democrats. And as we learned this morning, I guess ultimately Biden was successful. They finally called Pennsylvania, and that has given him enough electoral votes to have the lead. So it appears he will be our president elect. But I don't know that it turned out as badly for Trump as maybe conventional wisdom might have thought. I mean, in a lot of ways, it was still a very close race.
Oh, extremely close. I mean, honestly, even though ultimately Biden's going to win by who knows in the popular vote, 4 million, 5 million, we don't really know. He will win the popular vote, but you've got to look at the electoral map. And even if Biden gets over 300 electoral votes, if you look at each individual state, right? I mean, it's razor thin. Georgia, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Arizona, Nevada. So yes, it was very close. And look, you've got to give the Republicans credit because they also increased substantially the number of voters who came out and voted for them in comparison to 2016. It just so happens that more people came out and voted for Joe Biden than they did for Donald Trump. But look, the Republicans squeezed out a lot of new voters here, and they've been historically very good at the ground game and very good at turning out their base, and that's why the Republican Party has been so successful. And even if Biden, takes this election, like it looks like he will, this election was not a clear-cut victory for Democrats at all. I mean, if you look across the country, the number of seats that flipped in the House, right? And I don't know what the final total is going to be, but the Democrats will hang on to power, but they've lost 5 to 8 seats, maybe more. And then on the Senate, it looks like, the Democrats really thought they might have a serious chance of flipping the Senate, and that probably won't happen, although we'll have to wait and see with the runoffs in Georgia. So, I mean, the Republicans did exceptionally well.
Yeah.
And if you had to really pin it on one thing, I would just say that the difference was that the few independents, and there were a few that were truly independent, did kind of swing more towards Biden, and that probably made the difference.
Yeah, well, you know what? That makes a perfect segue, and I do want to say, yeah, for the Senate, you're correct. It looks like their best shot is with those runoffs, to potentially gain 2 seats to have a tie, which Vice President Kamala Harris would decide on. So that seems to, but that's sort of a long shot at this point, is my understanding. So yeah, you're right. They definitely didn't make those gains. And where the Republicans made gains, you mentioned bringing out their base. But what I thought was interesting was that Trump apparently did well with he increased the percentage of people who voted for him in every demographic. Every demographic except white men. And I'm going to read some statistics that I pulled up from Newsweek, and I've heard these said other places. With black men, Trump was up from 13% to 18%, so compared to 2016. Black women, he went from 4% to 8%. Latino men, he went from 32% to 36%. Latino women, he went from 25 to 28. Even white women, he went from 52% to 55%. And it was only white men where his support dropped from 62% to 58%. And I saw something on Brookings Institute. They calculated things a little differently, so I didn't want to conflate numbers and compare apples to oranges, but the same thing apparently happened with Asian Americans as well. And, so someone might ask, well, why is that? And I've heard some Black voices talk about this, but one of the things I think is sort of telling. So Joe Biden was on the Breakfast Club and was being interviewed by Charlemagne the God, who is a Black radio host. And Biden famously, so it's been being referred to as the "you ain't black" comment. And what Joe Biden said was, he said, well, and I don't have the exact quote, but it's basically, he said, if you don't know whether you're for Joe Biden or for Donald Trump, you ain't black. Now, I'm someone who kind of cringes when I see kind of the gotcha gaffe moment, like Mitt Romney's binder full of women. Well, I mean, that was taken horribly out of context. He was trying to say that, we have these group of female candidates that we're trying to hire. In this case, though, I don't think this isn't just a misspeak. He's saying there's an inherent idea that Joe Biden is expressing, that if you're a minority, you must be in favor of the Democratic Party. And I think something that Charlemagne brought up on his podcast with Andrew Schultz, and I've heard some other Black voices say too, is there's a lot of Black people who feel, well, you guys have been in charge, and what did you do for us? Joe Biden was the author of the '94 crime bill, which did more to put poor people and Black people in jail than any other piece of legislation for a while. It's done irreparable harm, increased the war on drugs, which Democrats are supposedly against. And this was, I mean, that's very problematic. And his vice president candidate was an attorney general known for instituting the Truancy Act, which put low income people in jail for missing school. Could put the parents in jail if their kids weren't in school in California. These are things that I think are legitimate criticisms that Black people and other minorities have had towards the Republican Party. And I don't know that they're addressing that, and that's a problem.
I couldn't agree more with you. I mean, that whole comment, and the fallout was just horrendous. I think for anybody, cringeworthy, as you were talking about,
Yeah.
and I think it really does speak to some of what we were foreshadowing earlier about some of the big problems and challenges that the Democratic Party has that it's going to have to wrestle with. So let's start with just the whole, quote unquote minority vote that everyone just assumes is going to go Democratic. Now, yes, the majority did still break for Joe Biden and the Democrats, but yeah, like you pointed out, we saw gains on for Trump and the Republicans on every demographic except for men, and that's fascinating. And it shows that you've probably, and your viewers probably heard this, that that was one of the assumptions I think the Democrat elite have been making for years, that somehow these minority groups are monolithic and you can count on them. And I think if you really kind of were reading between the lines and listening to some of the American leaders and Latino leaders, you would hear them saying things like exactly what you pointed out, like, well, wait, what have you actually done for us? And look, we're not going to put up with another, empty promises about change when change is not going to happen. And so there was some of that contingent that sort of like, look, I'm kind of done, and this is a protest vote. And even though maybe they didn't always love Trump, they at least saw Trump as being motivated by other things and possibly even to economically better the entire country. And I think that's another key point that Trump did well in. I mean, if you look at the exit polls and just for the Republicans generally, they did well around people who felt like the economy was doing, or they personally were doing better off economically. They voted in droves towards Trump. So anybody that sort of fell into that category was like 75, 80% likely to vote for Trump. So there's an economic component as well. So people really do care about their pocketbook and how they're voting. And so if you're a minority demographic and you're doing fairly decently economically under the Trump administration, yeah, maybe you look at it and say, I don't think the Democrats have done much for me. I might give Trump another try here. Now, again, we have to look at the entirety. I mean, even the Latinx vote was still only about 35% overall voting for Trump. But that's a significant bump from what happened 4 years ago.
Yeah, and also the other option is, and I've heard people talk about this too. Of course, the other option is just to simply not show up at the polls. You might not, maybe you don't think very favorably of Donald Trump, but you might not think favorably of Biden either, and you think either, well, maybe I'll go vote for a third party, or I'll just stay home. And I think there probably was a contingent of that too, although with such high turnout, it's hard to say.
Yeah, and I wish I could say I was a little more expert on any of these specific demographics. I mean, I have all sorts of personal theories, like I wonder sometimes, well, we've all heard that the Latino vote, in particular, the Hispanic vote, is not monolithic. Okay, that's been drilled into us. We know that. But, I don't know in particular what messaging could Biden have done differently or better to that group, for example, or to segments of that group. Like I wonder, there's probably a significant number of Hispanic descent or background voters in the U.S. that really aren't necessarily motivated by the immigration issue as much as I think the Democrats assume that they are. Now, I think many are, but I think that many have other motives or other priorities like the economy that we were talking about earlier and jobs.
Hmm. You mentioned Biden, but did Donald Trump miss an opportunity here? We saw, if we saw his percentages increase in these demographics, could he have done more to target some of these areas? Could he have maybe passed some legislation, maybe toward the end of his first term, that benefited Black voters or Latino voters or
Yeah.
Latinx? I probably should be saying Latinx, huh?
Well, honestly, that term has not been universally accepted, so
Oh
I
no.
don't
Okay.
know. It's kind of in transition. But anyway, I think that yes, there's much he could have done. It's funny that you were talking and we were both talking about the cringeworthy comment of Biden, but let's face it, on the whole, Trump has
Yeah.
had way more cringeworthy comments than Biden. It's just that
Mhm.
we're so used to it, right? So like even at the second debate where he was talking about how he was the least racist person in the room, and all these like things, like really, I mean,
Mhm.
it's just something you don't need to say, but he said it, and I think you're right, Brian. I really think he probably could have gotten more of the black vote and more of the Latinx or Latina vote, or and more of the Asian vote and more of the minority demographics if he had truly been somebody that was perceived as caring about those issues. Charlottesville hurt him very badly, whatever you want to say, with the African American community because of his sort of equating, at least the way the statement came out, of good people being on both sides of this, the protest. And I think that was taken a little out of context, but still, it just he has really had a hard time and struggled to sort of, um, uh, I guess, publicly chastise or distance himself from white supremacist groups, and I think black people definitely have paid attention to that, right? And so even
Mhm.
those who switched probably had to really consider that. I don't know if you are aware of this, Brian, but I actually have an African American stepbrother, a couple of African American
Oh, I
stepbrothers,
didn't know that.
and one of them happens to be a Trump voter. So
Hmm.
we had a lot of conversations about this, and he does agree that there's been some problems, with Trump and his rhetoric and how he's appearing. But in the end, he happened to be a black voter that was more interested in the economics, and he felt Trump would give him a better leg up, or a better leg up to the country. So those are the calculations, some of the calculations that I think people are weighing in
Hmm.
making decisions.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective. And as much as I always hate to extrapolate too much from a single anecdote, I mean, I think it is telling and it is interesting in what I've heard based on other things. And I just wonder, if that economic message coupled with some legislation that could really benefit certain demographics, he might have had. It's very possible he could have pulled out this election.
Yeah, I mean, I really think that, in the end, I'll be curious to see how historians kind of look back. We all will, right, at these 4 years and how they'll treat Donald Trump from an historical perspective. But I really feel like one of the missed opportunities for Trump and the Republicans really has been how they've been perceived and gone about trying to be more inclusive, in the party. And I think Trump's attempt, although he was a bit ham-handed with it, was I'm I'm a big economic tent. I don't care what race you are. Like I'm colorblind. That was kind of his message. I just care about everyone's economic well-being, and if I can bring everybody up economically, that's the thing that's going to make the difference. And there is some interesting, compelling evidence to suggest that it worked a little bit, but then he had some counter, statements and views that just really turned people off. And it feels like if he could have just stuck on message with economic prosperity and how he did more to help African American community from an economic standpoint in terms of just their overall wealth generation and job attraction, maybe he could have won a few more votes over. But he was his own worst enemy.
Yeah.
That's the bottom line.
That's kind of been a theme throughout his presidency is that he's been his own worst enemy.
Yeah.
But let's talk. I want to shift to some criticism that I think can be applied to national politicians in general. So, and I got this from the Jimmy Dore podcast, which is really one of my favorites, one of my new favorites. I'm pretty new to it. So I looked these up on my own too, but he talked about how it doesn't seem like either candidates their positions aren't really reflecting popular opinion. So I've looked at some Fox News exit polls. 72%, again, this is from Fox News. Um, the 72% of the people they interviewed favor change to a government style healthcare plan. 78% say racism is either very or somewhat a problem. 72% support a pathway to citizenship for immigrants. 72% at least were somewhat concerned about climate change, and 70% at least somewhat favor spending more on green energy. So clearly we have overlap. They didn't interview 72% of Democrats. So clearly there's overlap in their support for these issues. And we don't have Biden, as famously said, he's not in favor of Medicare for all. And as far as I know, he didn't vote for the Green New Deal. It doesn't support that either. So, what's going on here when we have, I've almost forgot to bring out that an increasing majority, at least 2/3, and that was in 2018. I think that's grown since then. 2/3 of people support marijuana legalization too. And we see that even in states that went Republican in their electoral voting, they voted in favor of legalizing marijuana, or at least legalizing medical marijuana, depending on the state. Why are we seeing this disparity between national politicians and their policies and the policies that the average person supports?
Wow, great question. Let me just add one quick thought to your statistics there, and I don't have these statistics in front of me, but I've seen them, that another reason why we're seeing larger numbers of people and larger percentages of people supporting these policies is because the baby boomers are starting to age out, right? And so, and we have a couple new generations of millennials and Gen Z, and these people are increasingly supportive of all of those policies. So those numbers are not going to shrink likely over time. So that's an important factor. But to get to the heart of your question, look, this is, I think, the nut of it is where I hear you going. I mean, there is criticism to be had with how our two parties are interacting with each other. And while we certainly can expect some dogfights and major struggles over policy and the substance of policy, we've become something else in this country, which is really disheartening and discouraging. And I don't know how we get back to a period where, yes, we had ideological differences. Yes, we had policy debates, but they were civil, they were informative, and ultimately it seemed like we were more willing to compromise. But today's parties, and it's not relegated to one or the other, it is truly both, are so polarized right now that it doesn't matter really, it seems like, what the general population thinks. What matters to the parties are, what does my base think? Because that's who we seem to be governing for, is our base in each party. And so I think the quintessential example is just the Affordable Care Act, because I like to remind people that this is initially a market-based Republican strategy for how you deal with healthcare and protect, to some extent, the private system as well, and allow private insurance, but also expand that insurance umbrella. This wasn't Medicare for all. This wasn't socialist medical policy in the sort of European sense. This was truly a market-based solution to try to solve the problem of meeting more health needs and lowering costs overall. Now, we could debate whether it would have been effective even in its perfect form, but at some point, Republicans decided that they wanted to be against this, and so they just essentially just reversed themselves completely on this topic, and have since just done everything possible, both in the legislative sense and also in the courts, to overturn the Affordable Care Act. Now, increasingly, though, Americans really said, wait, but we like parts of this act really a lot. We like that it covers pre-existing conditions. We like that it covers children up until they're 26 years of age. We like that it expands the amount of insurance and coverage for people, so that people just aren't left, just go to emergency rooms. And and just there's many other factors they like about it, and yet the Republicans kind of backed themselves in a corner here that they could not at least publicly acknowledge that there was any benefit. And so I think the proof of this is that for years they've said that they have an alternative to the Affordable Care Act, but in fact there is no alternative. There's never been a concrete Republican plan or strategy, either before or after Donald Trump, to replace the Affordable Care Act. So, but this is we're picking on the Republicans. We could also, look at the Democrats on lots of issues like immigration and how they've had a complete double standard about, under Obama, there was more increasing border security, more detentions, more deportations than ever prior to him. And yet, it seems as if we've somehow labeled Donald Trump as the bad guy and the boogeyman, where we kind of gave Obama a pass. And quite frankly, the trend was already moving in that direction prior to Donald Trump. But the Democrats seem to gloss over that as if it never happened.
Yeah, I mean, the kids in cages were pretty horrifying, but those cages were built under the Obama administration. They weren't built under the Trump administration. He used them, and I believe there were more deportations under Obama than there were under Trump as well.
Exactly. I mean, and the Supreme Court and this federal court nominees and appointments have been just really the sort of, poster child of these divisions, that it doesn't matter if Amy Coney Barrett was qualified or not, right? I mean, that wasn't the issue. The issue is she is probably going to vote conservative, and we just can't handle that as Democrats, and vice versa on the Republican side. And so, again, the point is they're not governing for the entire populace. They're governing for the people that support them already, and trying to convince people that that's the best path.
I'm gonna take that a step further. I'm gonna say, and this comes from something that Tulsi Gabbard said on the Joe Rogan podcast. So she's, for people that don't know, she ran for president, but she was also a congresswoman or senator. I can't remember. Senator, yeah, from Hawaii. And she said the very first day in Congress, they bring you in for your orientation, and they kind of tell you, here's your keypad, here's your key for the store, and here's, your basic orientation. And then partway through the day, they say, okay, Democrats over there and Republicans over there. And they basically tell you that you're here to win. You don't vote for Republican things because, and she was coming from the Democrats. I'm sure the Republicans were told the same thing, but, so you only vote what we tell you to vote for. You're not allowed to vote for the Republicans because you can't give them a win. So I'm going to take it a step further and say that they're not even doing it for their base. They're doing it for themselves.
Okay. Well, that's
what we seem to have is, if you looked at the Republicans and Democrats, if you looked at politics as an industry, well, you basically have Coke and Pepsi, and Coke and Pepsi have kept every other soda company from competing. They're out. And so if there's one thing that Coke and Pepsi will do well, it's they'll collude with each other to keep everyone else out. And that's what we're seeing with Democrats and Republicans. They have done everything they can to make sure that they are the only two parties in town. And they benefit from that enormously.
Yeah, I mean, and there's definitely some manifestations of that through things like election commissions, right? That clearly make it nearly impossible for third parties to participate, right, in campaigns effectively and in elections. So yeah, I mean, and I think that's trickles all the way down to the state houses, right? And the number of signatures you have to get to run, the number of percentage you have to get in primaries in order, to get onto the ballot. And so, yeah, there's a lot of things that discourage third parties and support the two parties.
Yeah, and why is that a problem? Well, so back in the day, for example, the Civil Rights Act passed with bipartisan support. There was people from both the Democrats and the Republicans. I believe the Environmental Protection Agency, the act that created that, also received both party support. The Affordable Care Act, however, only received, it was all Democrats, no Republican. It didn't receive a single Republican vote. And it can say the same with the Trump tax plan, also received no Democrat support. We're in an age now where it's just, you just don't support the other side's legislation, almost no matter what it is. The only exception, there's exceptions like the Great Outdoors Act, I believe, passed with bipartisan support. And what that means is, well, you either have a locked house, you have a divided house, and presidency, so you don't get anything done. Or to get things done, you have to have the entire, you pretty much have to own the presidency in both House and Congress. And that's a problem because now you have essentially one party ruling the country. And I don't think we want that. It seems like a good reform would be to enact some things that allow for more parties, which will allow for a diversity of voices and for coalitions to form that would allow for some compromise.
Wow. Okay. I didn't know you're turned into a radical, Brian. No, I'm kidding.
Funny that that's radical, right?
Yeah. Just to kind of support though a little bit of what you're saying. I mean, it's clear that the debates going on in Washington, but I think it's down at the state house level too. Wisconsin's a perfect example, are really happening within the caucuses. And by that, I mean, within the parties themselves. So you're right. It's sort of like about Tulsi Gabbard saying, once you're in, you're either on that side of the aisle or you're on that side of the other side of the aisle, and never the twain shall meet. At least it seems that way. And everyone's expected to toe the line, right? And I just want to go down to the state level for a minute, because look, we have some really, I think, really good, ultimately, representatives here in the Wausau area, Marathon County, overlapping with Marathon County, who I think are moderate conservatives, but I've heard them say that, in order to really get what you want, you have to give something, right? And so when they're down there in their caucus, there's some things I don't think they agree with, but they feel like they have to go along with those things in order to get the things done that they think are important. And quite frankly, that's kind of as you put it, that's the way politics are today, right? And what's interesting to me is that it's definitely creating artificial divides, like false arguments. It's like it's either this or that. And I think most voters, most people are really more nuanced in how they feel about things. And those statistics you brought up earlier about the Affordable Care Act, about just health coverage generally, about immigration, about many different issues. I think voters are somewhere in the middle here, but they're forced to choose one or the other when they vote, at least. And I think I might think you've gone a little too far, Brian, if I can say that.
Yeah,
In terms of like whether or not there is any compromise at all. I think one of the problems with the media is also doing us a disservice by focusing on those sensationalized topics and issues that are controversial, that can get talking heads on, and politicians for that matter, to really look like they're at complete odds over everything. There's actually a lot of compromise that does go on behind the scenes on a lot of mundane things, everything from just basic budgets, to health issues and all sorts of things where there is compromise and there is legislation being passed. Now, I'm not saying that it's as good as it used to be, and they definitely have run into corners, and especially around these hot button issues, whether it's immigration or look at the USMCA, the big trade act. I mean, ultimately, both sides kind of came around and said, "Hey, we really need to reform this whole trade situation with our near neighbors and China and everybody else." So that was very, in a lot of ways, it was very bipartisan. So I don't think I've completely become cynical that both parties are never looking out for anything other than themselves. I do think that does get in the way sometimes, and clearly around campaigns, it is the driving factor.
Sure. Well, it's been what, 6-7 months since we've had a coronavirus relief package, and I think that should be an easy one to compromise. So I'll accept your pushback, but I don't know if I may have overstated it slightly, but I don't think I've overstated it quite as much as you might believe I did. But we can agree to disagree.
No, I actually do think that you raised some great points. So don't take it as totally against what you're saying. In fact, I think that's a great.
Okay with arguing a little bit.
I think that's actually a great example and I think it didn't help. Right? Let's be honest. They did pass some relief measures, but once the elections, the campaigns really kicked in here, that's when it's sort of like all bets are off, right? So Mitch McConnell's like, I am not going to pass anything or give in. Let me rephrase it. I'm not going to give in to the Democrats' demands in an election year when this could hurt every down ballot Republican. And honestly, I think Trump, right, he wanted to get that legislation done. But
Yeah.
Mitch McConnell for a while was sort of the stick in the mud. And then I think Pelosi, you got to give her credit and blame as well, right? I mean, she
Hmm.
could have bent, she could have taken some of those parts of the a piecemeal, right? That was one thing the Republicans were saying. Well, can't we pass some individual things and not this comprehensive bill? And she refused to do it. And I think again for the
Yeah.
same reason, because it was an election year and she wasn't going to bend and hurt the down ballot Democrats on that.
Yeah, I think Trump famously said, give me a bill that's just plain relief for the average person, and I'll pass it. I don't know if that's exactly what he said, but I believe that's something he said. Whether that's true or not, well, you never know when it's Donald Trump. What is true with what he says, but at least he was willing to signal that, and I think that's pretty interesting. So I want to talk about given that we have Joe Biden likely as president now, assuredly as president, in what will likely be a divided Congress. First off, what did Republicans take away from this election, and where do Republicans go after they've had someone who was, as you politely put it, a norm buster, and someone who has, really, yeah, really destroyed a lot of those norms and really taken almost an autocratic direction as much as he could with the presidency. What do we see in 2024? Where do the Republicans go from here?
Yeah, Brian, this is a great question, and I don't have anything but speculative answers. But
Yeah.
I think we'll start by saying we all know, and if we don't, let me just make very clear, I know this firsthand, that many Republicans on the Hill, in the House, in the Senate, really did not love Donald Trump. I mean, I'm just going to be very blunt about it. Some said that to me very directly, but they really felt like, from an instrumental standpoint, meaning if we're riding his coattails, no matter how widely and crazily they swing behind him, because we're getting some things that we've wanted for a long time, including like stacking the federal courts with conservative judges, a new trade deal, a tax bill that favored business interests. There are a variety of things that I think Republicans said, I'm going to hold my nose and still go along with Donald Trump because essentially we're benefiting from it, and I think we just see this playing out in the election, and so that's what's so interesting and fascinating to me about this election. I mean, the Democrats were hoping for this enormous repudiation of all things Trump and all things Republican, and that is not what happened. The voters came in very divided and said, we actually support a lot of the things, initiatives and things that the Republicans are doing. So this is a really interesting conundrum, because on the one hand, you're going to have Republican voices that are going to say, well, thank goodness Trump is gone, and yet we can't ignore the fact that he had a huge populist support base of support and got new people into the Republican Party and energized about the Republican Party. Like, whatever happened to the blue collar workers that used to vote solidly Democrat? That isn't the
Yeah.
case anymore.
Nope.
And so, they've become Republicans, many of them, not all of them, many of them. And so we can't we have to make a choice here. Are we going to go back to the old style Republicanism, or is that a step backwards and we have to somehow embrace, some of the populism as well as some of the ideology that we consider conservative?
Yeah, I want to touch on something there too, because you can't pull the personality of that out of Donald Trump's success. I mean, if you watch one of his rallies, and I this was probably 6 months ago, maybe, or whenever, maybe it wasn't that long ago. Whenever he started doing rallies again, one of them popped up on YouTube that was live, and I was like, all right, I want to see what. And I've never really watched one, and I didn't watch the whole thing. I probably watched about 10 or 15 minutes, but watching it, it's like, oh yeah, this guy's like a stand-up comedian. I mean, he has like that sense of timing and that sense of like crowd work. It was just watching him do his rallies, like, okay, I understand why he's building this base. I understand why he was able to do that. I don't think anyone going that I can remember in my lifetime, from either side, really had that kind of crowd control and that kind of ability to work up a crowd and inspire them. Maybe the closest exception I could think of was Barack Obama. People really came away from his rallies feeling, especially his first term, felt like a sense of being energized, I think. But beyond that, I mean, I can't think of a lot of politicians that really just had that. It's like the one thing he was really, really good at is the one thing that helped him get elected. And I wonder, like, that's something that's not easy to replace.
I agree. I mean, look, I've listened to several of his rallies in complete, and I agree with you 100%. I think the guy is a master at talking to people and responding to the crowd, and keeping on script and going off script, and yeah, occasionally come out with some really crazy doozies, and yet he was able to do it in a way that really was kind of fun and exciting. Now,
Yeah,
if I heard many Democrats, who really couldn't stand him, who said, I could never listen to a whole speech, number one. And number two, and forgive me because I'm not trying to actually do this comparison myself, but I'm just repeating comparisons. Well, similarly, the fascists were able to be really energizing to crowds as well for some of the similar reasons. Now, again, I'm not
right.
saying I disagree, but you know, he was very good at it. I totally agree with you. And who in the Republican Party can step up and kind of fill that void? There, I don't really see anybody, but maybe like we were talking about earlier, maybe they're ready to go in a different direction, but it's hard to know. It's hard to know.
Now, theoretically, correct me if I'm wrong, but he would be eligible since he's only served one term. He could theoretically run again. And do you think he will? Will he be in jail for something something related to his taxes or his some of his business dealings? I don't think the Republican Party really wanted him the first time, but he managed to get his way in anyway. I mean, is it possible we could see a second, or I guess a third Donald Trump campaign?
Well, listen, I mean, who can predict, right? I mean, we all know now. First of all, can we finally talk about how we have to take a serious look at polls in America and whether or not we can
Yeah.
trust polls? But to the point, I don't know that I could ever predict something like that. But I'll tell you what, it wouldn't surprise me. Would it surprise
Yeah.
you? I mean, he's like we said, he's busted every norm. Why might he might? I could see him doing it.
No, maybe we'll see Trump Kanye 2024.
I mean, one thing that's really been fascinating to watch for me in this kind of early post election or post election days
Mhm.
is, and I think this will reveal a lot that we just don't know yet. Like, where are Republicans going to fall? The rank and file. Like, are they going to continue to support, for example, Donald Trump's legal battles to try to overturn the results of the election? Are they going to are they going to speak out against some of his statements where he's calling into question the integrity of the election, like he did like that first night, or are they going to just kind of remain silent and say, because I heard Donald Trump Jr. come out and basically say we're gonna remember if you supported Trump or not, and it's gonna affect our support for you in the future. I mean, he didn't quite say it in those words, but that was the
Yeah.
underlying message. And if Trump has still got that popular base that you and I were talking about, he could really do some damage for some Republicans, as he did all along the way of his presidency when there were elections, like the mid-year elections or even this election, with candidates who he thought weren't supportive of him. He went for the opposing candidate, and more times than not, he gave the bump needed to the ones that he was most supportive of, whether it's Tommy Tuberville, or what's the name of the woman in Georgia, the QAnon person who he also,
Oh,
and
yeah, I
and
can't
on and
remember.
on and on. So
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I'm really curious to see which way the Republicans break and who breaks where. I mean, we know Mitt Romney is already kind of in that camp. Ben Sass has come out of once or twice. What's Susan Collins going to do? We know Lindsey Graham is all on board with the Trump train
Yeah.
now, but what about some of these others? It'll be really
Good
interesting.
point. Hmm. Yeah, I guess we'll have to see what happens. I've heard talk of one of the Trump children possibly running. I mean, who knows? And it'll be interesting to see what happens because I can't think of anybody that repeats that same kind of energy and the ability to just work a crowd like that. I don't. I think possibly. I think coronavirus probably hurt him some too because I think he didn't have as many rallies as he did the first time around.
No, I would agree with that. I
And
mean,
I
he definitely
think
lost.
Biden benefited from that too, frankly. I mean, Is it, if we've seen from his Breakfast Club appearances, his appearances haven't always been great either.
Yeah, I agree. And remember, one of those first rallies, right, was that Tulsa rally, and oh boy, that was a fizzle, right? I mean,
Hmm.
and it's unfortunate for him because I agree with you. I think those rallies were sort of picking up steam before coronavirus hit, and yeah. So who knows how the ultimate effect would be? But Brian, I'm wondering, we've been kind of picking on the Republicans a little bit. Are we going to talk about the Democrats? Because I'm just as fascinated to see what happens with them.
Oh
Are
yeah,
you?
they're next on my list. The one thing I want you touched on that before we
Oh,
get to them,
yeah.
you mentioned the polls, and I think that's a good. I think there's going to be a lot of reflection on the polls, and the question I heard is: Are the polls wrong, or are the polls just wrong when it comes to Donald Trump? Is he somehow so out of the norm that the polls just can't account for him?
I mean, I don't know the answer, but I really want to know the answer badly. I have a suspicion, and I don't know if it's because of Donald Trump or if Donald Trump has just sort of exposed some of the problems that will now continue on with or without Donald Trump, which is that I think there were a lot of people, honestly, that don't like taking polls. I mean, I don't like taking polls. I mean, I get a call and maybe I'm not doing my civic duty, but I'm just like, I don't have time for this. I'm not
Yeah.
going to do it. So they're not getting me. And I wonder those who are Trump supporters, if they're already sort of opposed in general, not everyone, but they're generally opposed to mainstream media, quote unquote. And a lot of these polls, I think they put lump into the category because some of them are actually being funded by mainstream media that they are like, well, why would I want to do this poll? And I don't even think these things are accurate. So in a weird sort of self-fulfilling sort of way, they may be on average much less likely to take polls, much less likely to participate in this type of institutional scientific, quote unquote, scientific data gathering exercise. And I think that could explain at least a part of the reason why we're seeing what we're seeing.
And this has been a problem going back to when I was your student. I remember talking about how, in the age of as cell phones emerge and more and more people have those, and fewer have landline phones, that the people they're reaching aren't necessarily a representative demographic anymore. Now I think it's even different. I know some people my age, and especially people younger, don't necessarily answer cell phone calls. They want to answer a text. If it's a phone call, they don't want to answer it.
Yeah.
And so that's a problem too. I think we're going to see maybe a fundamental shift in how polls need to be conducted, because I just don't think it's effective anymore.
Well, the idea that if we do like this is a rough number between 1,000 and roughly 1,000, 1,100 type polls, and we do it somewhat randomly in terms of geography, and we make sure that we're hitting on these types of household incomes, that somehow that's going to give a statistically valid representative sample. Just we cannot necessarily count on that, and that's why you have these internal pollsters for the Republicans, for example, who've come out and watched them a little bit on Fox News and some other places, saying, "Look, we have a different formula, right? Our formula is based on multiple criteria. Everything from like I heard one pollster talking about might even been Kellyanne Conway because she was a pollster, but something about how did they hold a fishing or hunting license? That was one of the criteria they used to decide whether or not they met a certain demographic, which is not something traditional pollsters will do, and other kind of factors that might indicate whether they truly tend to vote conservative or lean conservative versus liberal. And I think those factors are much more nuanced, much more hard to factor in. And unless pollsters are willing to really re-examine this, it's going to be hard to have confidence in this going forward.
Yeah, and I should point out that's happened even at the local level. The Wausome School District thought their polling showed that there was a great support for their referendum questions, and they both failed.
That's
One was narrow, and one was pretty significantly. They were showing like 60-70% positive support, and when it came to the polls, the first referendum question lost by about 10 points.
That's a great example, Brian, because I was even thinking the same thing when I saw those statistics. I just thought to myself, I just don't believe them. They just seemed too inflated. And then I mean, I haven't examined the methodology used by the consulting firm, but in hindsight, it's clear that they just did not have a representative sample in any way, shape, or form. And look, it's increasingly hard to do so, but if you're going to claim to be doing these kind of polls, you'd better figure out a way to improve them,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's this problem comes up in with nutrition studies is that a lot of times they have what's called a healthy seeking behaviors bias. That healthy people that are seeking healthy behaviors will tend to respond to nutrition questions more than someone who isn't. And I think we might be seeing some of that bias in, and I'm not sure exactly what it is, but I think there's a certain bias that there's a certain demographic that's maybe more willing to answer polls than another one. In the case of national level polls, maybe Democrats are more likely to respond to polls than Republicans. That's an entire possibility, or it might be certain age groups. I don't really know, but that's something I think we're going to see a lot of self examination this in the coming months, I suppose. But yeah, let's pick on the Democrats. Where do they go? Where do they go from here? They didn't get the clear mandate that they thought they would. I mean, electorally, it's a pretty strong win, but I guess you could say from the popular vote, it's not close, but relatively speaking, I mean, it wasn't the just drenching of Republican and Trump values that I think they thought it would be. So, they were against a Republican president who oversaw pretty horribly by most measures. I think we can say a coronavirus pandemic. Called it a liberal hoax in the beginning, when at a time it would have been really critical to get some infrastructure in place. They still didn't really beat him very badly as you might expect someone who botched a pandemic as much as he did. I think it's fair to say. Yeah, what do they take from this, and where do they go from here?
Look, it's easy to say this because I'm talking about the margins and not the mainstream. But on the margins, I
Mhm.
fundamentally believe that this was not a vote for Biden. I believe it was a vote against Trump. And so that does not bode well for the Democrats. And I think the reason why I feel confident about stating that is because if you, like we talked about earlier, if you look at the down ballot, the Republicans actually did much better than I think anyone thought they'd do, even themselves. And
Yeah.
right. Why is that? What is going on? And I think, I was one of those people who probably thought that because the rising generation, the millennials and the Gen Z, they're coming up and voting now, are all indicating, at least by polls, I don't know if you can
Yeah.
trust,
Yeah,
but
exactly.
that they, are more progressive, and they're supporting a more progressive agenda that you brought out earlier. So, this is just in the long game, this is going to favor the Democrats. And as long as, we continue in that direction, it's just a matter of time before Democrats eventually win the state houses, win the presidency and the Congress on a more regular basis. That doesn't mean there won't be some swings and things, but I don't know now. I'm gonna sort of walk that back a little bit, because when I look at what's going on in the Democratic Party, they're in serious trouble in this sense. They won an election, but now they're going to have to figure out who's in charge, who's governing within the caucus. Is it the progressives? Right? There's already been conversations with Pelosi and some of her House followers that have been very what's sort of looking for not antagonistic, but very abrupt. Like, hey, what's going on here? Whose fault is this? And the progressives want to get rid of the Pelosi generation. They
Mhm.
want to get rid of the Schumer generation. They want progressive politics. And that is what seems to energize the younger voters. But could they have won the election if that progressive side had won? Even now, Pelosi sent out a message right after the election saying, please mind your statements to the press, because we've got two runoff elections in Georgia. And if it looks like we're too socialist or too, left leaning, it's going to hurt the chances of us regaining the Senate. Now, boy, I'll tell you, if you're a progressive, that's not going to go over very well, right? And that's just more evidence that the party is not delivering on what you think it should be doing. So I'm interested to see where the Democratic Party goes, and whether or not they can even take advantage of this, having after the presidency.
Yeah, and I wonder, we have two examples where it was one where it was successful, that strategy, and one where it was unsuccessful. In 2016, that rejection of more progressive values was unsuccessful and helped Donald Trump win. And in 2020, it seemed to help Biden win. So, I'm not sure what the answer is there, to be honest.
Yeah, I've heard people talking about how maybe that's one silver lining for Democrats, is they've got Kamala Harris rather as the in the wings, and she's not exactly millennial, but she, at the very least, is sort of a bridge to a younger generation, a younger sort of perspective, a little more attuned to that perspective. Still, I don't know that that's going to be enough. It depends on, whether people, she's given a chance to actually do something substantive, and if she's the presumptive, Democratic follow on from Biden whenever he ends up out of office. So, but there's so much on both with both parties to be sort of optimistic about, but also somewhat pessimistic in terms of whether they can actually, become unified and govern in a way that can get policies passed that their base cares about.
And you talked about the generational part aspect of it, and I think that's interesting. But I also think the geographical aspect is interesting, and I am hearing a lot of people that are moving out of New York and California, and seeing a lot of evidence of that. I can't wait to see the 2020 numbers because I think they're going to be pretty substantial. But it's interesting to see. I think we're seeing a migration of Democratic voters to states that maybe were traditionally Republican. I think we saw that happen in Colorado, quite some time ago, and I think we're starting to see that. Arizona went blue. Texas was way closer than you would ever think Texas would be.
Georgia.
Georgia, I mean, and and I think that they associate that with New York folks moving out of the state. A lot of them settle on the eastern seaboard, and is that a factor too, even beyond, especially when you have an election that's determined by the electoral college? Does that play a big factor too?
It does. And I would say the other twin part of that factor is not only the demographic shifts that might be underway, but how, the state houses, who's controlling state houses in the aftermath of the census, right? Because now we're going to go through another redistricting process around the country. And let's take Wisconsin as an example. I mean, it was clearly redistricted to favor Republicans. I mean, vastly so. If they're controlling 2/3 of each house, or half in the case of the Senate now, and yet their voting is twice as many in the Senate now, but the vote is like literally right down the middle. So will we ever get to a point where we have sort of representation that looks like the popular vote? I don't know, and that's where the Republicans really are hoping they can hold on to power, is by having control over the state houses to control the redistricting. So even if the demographic shifts happen, it won't matter as much if depending on who gets to redraw those districts.
Yeah, I remember when I was a reporter at the Stevens Point Journal, and I was covering a race, and one of the candidates was in Stevens Point, and the other was in like Toma. And then another one was in a different year, was in like some town I had never even heard of, and I think I said to the lady, I have to admit, the town you're from, I'm like, I've never even heard of it. Like, can you really say that these two areas share some kind of common interest, or it would make sense for them to be linked up into a similar district? And she gave me some kind of nonsense answer, frankly, but I think it's pretty clear that those boundaries are absolutely gerrymandered, and one of the worst maps in the country. It's true that gerrymandering and redistricting isn't an issue. It's not a Republican Democrat issue exclusively. And on the East Coast, many of those areas are gerrymandered to favor Democrats, and so I hear the solution is like nonpartisan redistricting. So tell me, my question to this, and I have to admit, Patrick Snyder brought this up, and it's something I've been thinking about. He didn't put it this way, but my thought is, where are these nonpartisan folks that are going to staff this board, right? Like who's selecting them? And in a way, I was thinking, would it make more sense to have them bipartisan, so you have an equal representation of both sides, and they have to come up with maps. So the idea is like they come up with this, they'll push and pull, and somewhere in the middle will lie the districts. I mean, what do you think about that, I guess?
Well, I'm not going to lie about it. I really would like to see some better redistricting process than we currently have, because it just is going to continue to cause these swings and, frankly, questions about representation and fairness. Having said that, I totally take Pat Snyder's point on this, that it's really, really tough, especially now that we don't trust anything anymore, right? I mean,
Right.
there really isn't any evidence of any widespread fraud. I'm not saying there weren't a couple of fake ballots here or there that might have happened in this election, but it's obvious that there's been no massive manipulation of votes here, but people don't trust anymore where they're getting their news and how it's happening. So are they going to trust anybody that's supposedly neutral to redraw the districts fairly? I don't know. I think in some states what they do is they kind of default to judges because somehow they sort of think that judges are a little more neutral since most, not all the time, sometimes they are elected, but a lot of times they're appointed and don't really have that political pressure on them. But again, it's still going to come down to the same question. And yeah, so I mean, I think both sides would have to be able to say, well, at least we see something that represents us in this decision, or how could we ever accept it as being truly impartial?
Yeah, and I mean, I guess that seems like the best way you can really get a nonpartisan district is if both partisans, both parties, and of course we're still operating in the two-party system, but if both of them are able to give input and kind of have a little tug of war, if both sides are pulling against the rope, it's going to end up the little marker is going to end up somewhere close to the middle, I think, because I don't know that you can have a truly nonpartisan body. Snyder's point in during the debates were, well, didn't Tony Evers appoint most of those people that are on the commission, the Fair Maps Commission? So are they really nonpartisan? I was like, yeah, you kind of have a point. I mean,
No, I mean, I agree. That's the thing. Like, if you're a Democrat and you're in charge now of redistricting, what incentive do you have to make it impartial, right? And
right.
same as on the other side. I'm just speaking as a citizen who would like to just see election processes be as fair as they can. And I know it's not perfect. It will never be perfectly fair, but let's try to approach that. And it just seems like this back and forth, like whoever is in charge gets to, to the victor goes the spoils, just seems to perpetuate these cycles. And not only just the cycles, I'm even okay with the fact that sometimes Democrats are in charge and sometimes Republicans are in charge and sometimes it's a mix. My biggest concern is the swings and the hyper and extreme partisanship. And that's one thing that I think gerrymandering has done is it's encouraged like tons. There's way more safe districts now in the House and in the state House than ever before. And then what happens is that silences actual policy debates, right? Because then it just, like we talked about earlier, it becomes like a non-transparent caucus-based decision-making process, and nobody likes that. I mean, who likes that? I mean, except when your party's in power, but you hate it when the other side's in power. So, how do we get something that's a little more transparent so that we can actually know why we're voting for who we're voting, what they stand for, what the policy is that we care about?
Yeah, and I mean, and if you're a moderate of either of your party, you might not like it either, because that system tends to encourage the extremes on both sides of the aisle. So, what do you think about? There's, I believe, two states now doing this: Maine and Nebraska. Correct me if I'm wrong. If there's another one that are doing separate districts for their electoral college. So, there's a district in Maine that gives a certain number of points. Now, I don't profess to completely understand it since it's not in my state, but what do you think about that idea? Because I think about like California. If I'm Frankly, if I'm a Republican or a Democrat, I don't know what's my point of voting. My state's going to go to Democrat anyway, right? Like,
Yeah.
I mean, should I even vote in a presidential election, or what's my incentive? If I'm in, I guess we can't say Texas anymore. I'm trying to think of maybe was it West Virginia is the one that's
Yeah, West
still
Virginia.
that's still super red, right? Yeah. So
Right.
if
Super.
I'm there and I'm a Democrat or a Republican, I don't. Do I feel like my vote really counts? I'm not sure, but
Yeah, I've heard many people talk about this wasted vote idea, right? It doesn't matter what party I'm in, if it's so one-sided, it's essentially a wasted vote. But yeah, I mean, I don't think I'm not going to claim I remember I had to read up on this right before our podcast here, but I do know that it's something like there's a certain number of electors in Maine and Nebraska that are based on the general popular vote. So there is a way to win some votes if you win the overall vote. But then they've also divided some votes by district, and that can go to either party, whoever wins that district. So it is this kind of split vote, more representative apportionment of electoral votes. And look, I used to be pretty traditionalist around things like electoral college, like, well, the founding fathers set it up that way. But the more that I've sort of thought about it and looked at it, and frankly, because of the situation where with this extreme politics and extreme hyperpolarization, I've been trying to think of ways, how do we get a little bit more to civility and to compromise? And I frankly have kind of turned the corner in my own thinking that I wouldn't mind seeing more states go to this more apportioned system based on actual voter representation. It just seems fairer to me, and it still gives the advantage to the candidate that gets the overall vote tally. They still, at least based on the Nebraska and the Maine model, they would get a couple extra electoral votes. But I personally would like to see us move in that direction. But that's a state decision. That's firmly in the hands of the state as to whether or not they want to do it. I'd like to see us explore that in a more serious way.
Do you think that benefits any one particular party over the other? I feel like it kind of depends where it is, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure because I honestly have not read the research around it. It's possible that the research would show that somebody's done the statistical analysis and showed that somehow it would benefit this party, that party, and I honestly don't know which way it would turn. That's not my motivation. But
Sure.
I look at California. I look at California
Yeah.
as the quintessential example. I mean, my gosh, how many electoral votes are we up to there? It's 50. It used to be 54, but maybe it's more. The point is, it's a huge number of electoral votes, and
Right.
they all go to the Democrats every single
Mhm.
year. And yet, we have a good number of Republican representatives in California. And there are some
Yeah.
areas in California that are clearly red, but it never goes red. And
Yeah, I think a lot of the Northern California goes red. I think a lot of the interior, not on the coast, goes red. And it depends on the part. That's what I've heard anyway. I haven't looked into
so,
it
I
too
mean,
deeply, but
so again, I'm not trying to be partisan about it. I'm just thinking if I were a Republican in California, I would much rather have a sort of a more apportioned electoral system.
yeah, hmm definitely. Same thing. I would imagine if you're a Democrat in Texas, you would want the same. But it seems like overall, yeah, it would make a lot more sense for a closer representation of the people while still kind of maintaining those state
But but
rights.
what we should do, Brian, one of us needs to look up those. Somebody's looking at the recent election statistics when we kind of get those in to see how that might have affected the election. Because I don't know. It could be that when we look at those statistics, we'll see, oh, that would have really much more benefited the Democrats or the Republicans. I'm not sure, but it'd be interesting to look that up.
It would be, yeah. Well, any closing thoughts that you wanted to make on this election? Anything that I'm sure there's tons of things that we probably could have talked about but haven't yet. But
Yeah, there was one little point I was going to make going back
mhm.
to the issue of like the Democrats. There's this really interesting article I just read in the Atlantic by George Packer, and it's more of an op-ed. But the only reason I'm bringing it up is because the Atlantic is generally a liberal leaning publication, but I'll tell you they are pretty self-critical at times about liberal policies. And this particular op-ed I really enjoyed because basically he said, look, he wasn't pushing the Republican agenda or having much nice things to say about Donald Trump. But what he said is, if we think that this bodes well for the Democrats, you should really think again because the Democrats have shown that they are very tone deaf to the hordes of American people. I shouldn't say hordes because I don't mean it negatively.
Yeah.
The massive amounts of American people who
hmm
really came out and supported Trump or came out and supported Republican candidates. And the Republicans have, I'm sorry, the Democrats have often referred to these as pejoratively as the flyover states, right? And that's kind of like the attitude that a lot of them have had towards people who are living in more rural areas. And if they don't figure out a way to appeal to rural and working class voters, white males and others, that they just don't seem to pay attention to, they're never really going to get that sort of mandate that I think Democrats are hoping and expecting that someday they will get and never quite achieve. And part of it is because they've created a culture of elitism, and he sort of talks about that and how and this makes it's very hard for them, especially because now that we have media where no matter what my political background, I can find someone who takes my side, right? So if I go to MSNBC, I'm going to find and listen to Rachel Maddow, I'm going to find all the arguments on the progressive side of the issues that I really think are excellent. If I go to Fox News, certain people or other publications, I see all that. But what we're not so my point is, and his point is, Democrats are living in a bubble, and they're not really paying attention to what is going on. And then part of the problem is, as people, as human beings, we're already sort of predisposed towards motivated reasoning, right? So if I I feel like I'm being looked down upon by the Democratic elite, and a lot of people do. And then Fox News comes in and says, you're being looked down on by the Democratic elite, and here's some examples of that. Then it just reinforces that view. And that view is going to continue to be reinforced unless Democrats learn how to change their message. So again, I know I'm sort of picking on the Democrats again, but that's a very interesting op-ed by George.
Yeah, well, it's, you and I could really probably do a whole other podcast on media, and I have a lot of things to say on media and how it's changed and where the models are going. And one of the things we didn't really talk about too is misinformation that kind of goes into that. People aren't just going between the Atlantic and Fox News. They're going to places like the InfoWars and Breitbart, and I can't remember. For some reason, I'm not thinking like a really left-leaning sort of site off the top of my head, or just the Twitter or social media echo chambers that happen too. I mean, there was some good research that showed people were way more partisan on social media than they are in just normal context in real life. So when you see these conversations on Twitter, it might lead you to believe, oh, this is how most people feel because it's a representative of all these people, but it's really not. It's really a more hyper-partisan viewpoint than you would get in the standard thing. And then we had, we didn't even really talk about all the misinformation that was going on I guess I can't even say post-election, mid-election. Would you still call it the election week? I feel like it's kind of like when someone says they're having their birthday week. We're having election week now. It's the new thing, but.
Okay, is that a millennial thing, Brian? Because I've never honestly heard of birthday week in my life.
I'm pretty sure it's a millennial / Gen Z thing. I never did that.
In my generation, Gen X, I'm not quite baby boomer. I mean, it was birthday. You didn't get anything beyond your day.
Oh yeah, no, I've been lobbying for a birth minute. Like, let's have one little minute and we'll get it over with, and then I don't want to think about it again. but yeah, so now we apparently have election week. But during this week, I mean, we've had so many people reporting. There's been these groups calling "Steal the Election" or "Stop the Steal." I think these Facebook groups popping up that Facebook has been trying to slam down because they're just a hive of misinformation about the election and about these. I heard one worker is now like hiding and is afraid for their life because they threw out, like, someone included when they turned in their ballot, they included like some information slip, and like the person just threw out the information slip, and they were reporting that the guy was throwing out ballots, and he had all these threats on social media. I mean, just what do you even do when people don't even believe the truth? This is sort of a crisis for media too, and something that's been bothering me, especially since I feel like a lot of national media has become hyper-partisan.
Oh, Brian, you're right. We could go on all day. I mean, you're pressing all my buttons because it's frustrating, for someone who believes in critical thinking. And I'm not saying that mainstream media is spot on. In fact, there's so many problems that they have. But on the other hand, why are we as a populace so willing to believe the most outlandish conspiracy theory just because we saw it on the internet? And yet we've somehow lost perspective. And I would really love to talk more about that someday because it's a hard thing, but we've got to get our handle on that.
Well, I've had another media person in Stevens Point has been wanting to do a media podcast, and maybe I'll bring you on for that one too, because I think you'd have some real great insights. But yeah, the misinformation has been troubling. I think we're really seeing some hyper-partisan reporting from organizations. I've seen some very disturbing trends from organizations that I used to trust, like the New York Times and the Washington Post. I mean, these are ones that I used to trust a lot. I'm seeing some very hyper partisan things and ignoring of other things that I don't like. And yeah, there's definitely things we should get into about that. Well, I guess overall, what do you think people should take away from this election, and how would you want to cap off this podcast?
Well, I'm always looking for the glass half full silver lining, and this is the obvious one. But one obvious thing is, I mean, hey, we had more voter turnout than we've had ever historically, and people were really engaged one way or the other. Another positive that I've been thinking about as I was preparing for the show today, Brian, is,
Mhm.
I have to say that I don't want to say pleasantly, that might sound like it's like I'm not caring, but I'm pleasantly surprised at, frankly, the smoothness of how things actually have gone so far in this kind of election week, as you put it. That, I mean, yes, there's some protesters and some are, but it's been largely peaceful. Now that could turn, that could change, things could get nasty and ugly. So again, this is a mid week assessment, but so far it looks like democracy is working. And believe it or not, I said the same thing after the 2000 election. I was old enough to remember that as hard as that was for many people to accept, because it just came down to literally a few hundred votes, in a way, democracy did work, and we didn't break down into a civil conflict. And I think a lot of people were talking about that. I wish they weren't saying things like that, but I heard that kind of talk about civil unrest. And it seems like we're transitioning and doing so in a peaceful way, which says a lot about, who we are as a nation and what we believe in.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I'm so glad that democracy has prevailed once again, and it's still like it was definitely an interesting one. Smoothly is sort of a relative word, but at the end of the day, at the end of the day, it
That's
didn't, like you
right.
said, it didn't descend into complete chaos, and we'll call that a win. So, Eric, I want to thank you so much for being on the podcast today, on the Keep It Awesome podcast, and you have your own podcast, right?
Well, we have our Two Bald Guys show. We're on a little bit of hiatus because we're in the middle of planning for a pretty big statewide conference. But
Hmm.
yeah, Dave Anderson and I do that, and we kind of bring on guests too. So the more the merrier, the way I see it. And it's nice to be the guest as opposed to the host, because one of my show is that we purposely don't take sides on issues. And I'm not trying to take sides, but I don't do a lot of analysis. I just ask questions. So it's fun to kind of,
Gotcha.
be on the other side of that microphone. But thanks for having me.
Yeah, I appreciate it. This was a really different podcast for me. I haven't done, like I said, I usually don't prepare a lot of notes beforehand. Most of the time when I have guests on, I usually know them beforehand or probably done a story on them. And so I usually know enough to ask good questions. And yeah, I definitely did more talking on this one than I usually do in my podcast too. So it kind of was that for both of us, I guess. But yeah, anything else? Where can people find the podcast? Is it on YouTube,
They
iTunes?
can go to WIP's Facebook page, WIPPS.org, and they can check it out. Also, go on our website to find the archived views. But we'll be starting up again. We're going to do a special pre-Thanksgiving podcast on I think it's November 19th or 20th. I think it's the 20th. So
Cool. Well, Eric, I have all my guests end the podcast by saying keep it awesome. So keep it awesome, Eric.
I will keep it awesome, Brian.
All
Thanks.
right. And you guys keep it awesome out there too. Thanks so much for listening. And make sure you leave us a good rating on iTunes, give likes and thumbs up, and subscribe on YouTube and all that. So take care, guys. Bye bye.